Hey, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. Great to have you with us once again this week. And I'm here with Pastor Nick Cady, who is the pastor of Whitefields Community Church here in Longmont, Colorado. And we, second week now of our new series called Upside Down, a study through Paul's letters to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And of course, we got that title Upside Down from Acts chapter 17, as that was the accusation levied against this new church there at Thessalonica, as Paul was there like, hey, you've turned this city upside down and you haven't done this. This is not the first time, And so it was almost a great thing to be branded with, And I think that's what the disciples of Jesus were setting out to do, is turn the world upside down. And so we're in week 2, and the title of this message was kind of a play on words from a popular phrase that imitation is the serious form of discipleship. Yeah, that's right. And but one of the things that you kind of hit on right from the beginning was Paul, starts to defend himself against his critics. And this is kind of one of those kind of situations where, when do we as leaders in a church, as a pastor, when do you feel that need that you need to answer your critics? Should you answer your critics? Should you just ignore them and just say, hey, I'm doing the work of the Lord, I'm ignoring you, I'm not going to listen, stick your fingers in your ears? Or do we answer our critics? Kind of what are some of those, what are some of the parameters surrounding that question?
Yeah, what's interesting is that Paul in this section, what's curious is that he defends himself. That's the whole context. He's defending himself against people who are saying negative things about him. But then he says in verse 4 that he doesn't do this to please men, but to please God, and it's to God that he'll have to give his answer, right? So I think that's really interesting because he has kind of both sides of that attitude, right? A lot of times you meet people who will say, well, I don't care what anybody thinks about me. I only care about what God thinks about me. Well, I think that that's important, and of course that's primary, but clearly Paul did care what people thought about him, and I think the thing to keep in mind here is that the reason why Paul cared what people thought about him was because he cared about the gospel. He had been entrusted with the gospel, and he was concerned that if people thought negatively of him or believed things about him, that by discrediting him, these people were actually putting the gospel message at threat. So when it comes to answering your critics, it's interesting because there are 2 proverbs, and they're right next to each other in the book of Proverbs. And the one proverb says, do not answer a fool in his folly, or else you will bring yourself down to his level. In other words, like when they go low, we go high type of attitude. The other proverb, which is right in the same section, says, answer a fool in his folly, lest he think he's right. Right? So there's a time for both. And it takes wisdom to discern, okay, is this a time where I need to respond to this accusation, where I need to address this thing this person is saying, which is incorrect? Or is this a time when, I'm not going to stoop to that level and just get into the muck with that person, so I'm just not going to do it? I guess there's a saying, like, I heard an old saying, and I'm probably going to get it wrong, but it was something about, like, if you wrestle with a pig, you both get dirty, but the pig enjoys it. Oh. So I'm probably getting that wrong. Maybe one of our
I think you got the gist of it right.
Can leave a comment and tell me how to say that right. But it's something like that.
Yeah.
And I mean, certainly that's the case, right? Like where some people, they just want that. They're contentious people. They're always going to, and you know what? It's just not even worth it to get into it with them. You're just going to muddy yourself, and it's not worth it. But there are other times when it is very worth it, especially if by discrediting you, they're threatening, your mission, which is to represent the gospel. One of the things I always say, and this, is that I always say, personally, for me, I want to be known for only one controversy, and that's the controversy of the gospel, which means in my social media presence and in everything that I do and the way that people know me, of course I have opinions about lots of things, but the one thing I care about more than anything is the mission that I've been called on by God. And so I want to think about my actions in that regard. Like, how am I going to live in a way that reflects well upon the gospel? And Paul talks about that a lot in his letters. So he talks about it in 1 Thessalonians here. He says, I charge you to walk in a manner worthy of God. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 27, he says a similar thing. He says, let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 2, he says, live in such a way that you do not bring disrepute upon the gospel. And so so I think that we should care about what people think about us as messengers of the gospel, not because we are thin-skinned or anything, but we should care about that aspect. We remember that we're people on mission, and that is the primary driving thing in our lives.
Mm-hmm. So, more in a practical sense, what kind of advice would you give to a pastor or somebody, who maybe gets that nasty letter in the email, or, responding to their sermon, or, something they might have said, or their conversation? What are some of the things, practically that would come to mind that in response to something like that?
Yeah, again, another proverb is that a kind word turns away wrath. And that's what I've always found, is that the first response I want to have is I want to take the teeth out of the conversation, so to say. And so just respond, surprise them with kindness, and just, be humble. Humility is disarming. And so, that's what you want to do. You want to take the tension out of the situation so that you can discuss the issue. Mm-hmm. And if there is an issue, then you acknowledge it and be honest. If there's not, and maybe what they're bringing up is just a matter of difference of opinion or something like that, well, then you can deal with that too. I think the immediate thing you want to do is respond with humility, and oftentimes a kind word. Just try to take the teeth out of the situation.
Yeah, no, that's great. Great advice. Great advice. One of the other topics, of course, which was kind of the main theme of our study in the first half of chapter 2 of 1 Thessalonians, was the idea of imitation. And, I think I wouldn't say for the most part, but a lot, you see a lot of Christian bumper stickers that say, hey, don't follow me, follow Jesus. I'm sinner saved by grace, and these kind of not necessarily cop-outs, but this idea that, hey, don't look at my life, look at Jesus. Well, Paul's kind of has an opposite look at. He says, no, look at my life, and you should see Jesus. The whole idea of imitation, that was a very important point that you made on Sunday.
Yeah, because Paul's putting his life forward in this section to say, imitate me in these areas. And he points out 3 that we talked about, right? We talked about motives, actions, and priorities. And I think that's really important, And he says, you can look at my life because the power of God is real in my life. And I think that's really important. You can think about it this way. How were the Thessalonians to know how to imitate Jesus? Because even if they had the scriptures, which it's not likely that they did at this point, maybe they had portions of the Gospels at this point. But think about it, or even you, right? Like, if you read the Bible and you want to imitate Jesus, well, it's going to be really easy for you to know exactly what to do when you encounter a Pharisee asking you whether you should pay the temple tax, because Jesus answered that question. Mm-hmm. Or if, they bring a woman caught in adultery before you when you're standing in the temple. But let's say for a mom, how does a single mom know how to follow Jesus in her context? How does a person who works in a store, what does it mean to follow Jesus in a office setting, right? Mm-hmm. These are areas where it does help us very much to have mentors who can help us to know how to follow Jesus. And then we get to be those for other people as well.
Yeah, and I think what's also very important is Paul's not saying, hey, imitate me in my success. He's imitate me in my failure as well. And that Paul, in his various letters, he points out how he is the chief among sinners and things like that. And that, I think that's also, very important for believers to understand that, yes, imitate me as I imitate Christ, but imitate me as I seek the Lord in forgiveness, as I seek when I fall. Look at how I go back and how I seek, I think those are also, maybe people forget those aspects of the Christian walk and say, well, don't look at me because, I'm failing before the Lord. Well, how do you then restore, seek restoration before the Lord? Those things are also important in the life of believers.
Yeah, I know that one of my mentors was really good at that. He would really, he would show you through his actions what it looks like to repent, mm-hmm. and to ask for forgiveness and to humble himself. And those things stuck with me.
Yeah. And, there's that old Christian cliche that says you might be the only Bible that people ever read. And it's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason, because it's very true.
Yeah.
If as you're living out the Christian life, you might be that person, that first encounter with Jesus that people have. Yeah. And so I think that's probably one of the most important takeaways from Sunday's message, is that, to imitate, to seek to be that way with the Lord, so that people could look at your life and become, to follow God through your life and your example of following the Lord. So that was a great look into our just kind of a different perspective, maybe, into our study from Sunday. And if you missed it, whitefieldschurch.com, you can go there and download that. You can find us on YouTube. Ring that bell. You'll get a notification every time we upload a new video. And of course, we're on Instagram, Facebook, and you can also subscribe to our podcast on Spotify. So we look forward to your questions, comments, and we look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.